All right, we'll give our public attendees a moment to get in here into the meeting, and then we can get started. All right, Linda, go ahead.
Well, welcome everybody. This is the 10th meeting of this commission. And as we were kind of joking about before as we gathered in the room, much has happened since we released our interim recommendations in November. And a lot of it is pretty exciting news for this commission. So we're looking forward to sharing some of that with you today. Since the commission's first meetings, of course, Dan and I have stressed the urgency of our work together and the need for actionable recommendations. And I think we're actually seeing some of that. And I personally am delighted by that. It's been an unusual start to a new year for many of us, sometimes collectively, sometimes personally. It hasn't necessarily been the easiest start, but on this level, the governor has heard our messages and has already put forth legislation that's going to implement several of our priorities. And we're going to hear from Hannah about LD1 in a few moments. So I just want to, given that this is the 10th meeting, I want to thank you all again for all of the work that you've done that has gotten us to this point. It's gotten us to a really successful point of action. And we're looking forward to these next steps, including the small group work we're about to embark on. So Dan, I'm handing it to you.
Sure. Thanks, Linda. Just very briefly, as Brian mentioned, today's meeting is a 2-hour meeting. We're trying to make the larger meetings a little bit more efficient as we're going to go into, as you all know, committee meetings, smaller group meetings to really dive more specifically into the major topics that we presented to the governor and draft back in November. Echo Linda's comment on our first interim recommendation, and that was actionable items. We didn't realize that I guess we impressed the committee, impressed the governor, and her first actionable item in 2025 is LD1, which is a first step towards helping fund some of the recommendations that we've made. We're going to hear about that from Hannah and Bob Carey and Ann Fuchs and Brian in a minute. It is winding its way through the legislature. As I've been informed, it's a bipartisan bill, which is great. It's not unanimously supported yet, so we may be asking people on the committee to weigh in on the importance of getting some of this done and out the door early. It would be great to be able to celebrate our final report saying that we've already set a number of things in motion and that are supported not just by the committee, but by the state. After that, we're going to hear from Samantha Horn, the new director of the Maine Office of Community Affairs, to talk about some of the actions that we've talked about and how things within the state budget will fall out relative to her committee. Then after that, we're going to hear from Sam Brody, who will share their recent analysis around flood risk and data in the state of Maine, which I think is going to form some of our recommendations relative to time frame when we do our final report. So we'll get into it now. I want to turn over to Hannah. Hannah, if you would bring us up to speed on what's happening in the legislature with the bills.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Linda. I think you both actually set this up well. I'm going to provide just a quick overview of what is in LD1 and then pass it off, as you noted, to Bob, to Anne, and to Brian to kind of go into some of the details. So next slide, Brian. Great. I think Dan just noted this. I mean, I will just say it is a big deal that this is LD1. I just want everyone on this commission. I think you've all reflected this. I think Dan and Linda have really pushed that this is, we didn't sign up for this commission to just kind of put out some pretty reports and spend some hours on Zooms and go to meetings. We actually want to get something done. And these are issues. We heard urgency when we visited communities this summer and fall. I think this commission has worked with urgency, and I think the governor feels that this is an urgent topic, and it has been since she took office. But I think the storms of December and January really lent that urgency. So LD1 is a governor's bill that has a couple of different components. I just want to give a little more background on LD1. Is not a decision made by the governor. The first bill of the session is not sort of up to her. It is up to the leadership of the legislature. And I think the speaker and the Senate president, as well as Republican leaders, were looking for something that they could do together in a bipartisan way. They knew the governor was working on this initiative, and they said, we'd like to make it LD1. So I think we're starting off in a really good place. This is, again, a governor's bill. It's the primary sponsor is Senate President Daughtry, with Speaker Fecto, Leader Billy Boggs Buckingham, as well as Leader Stewart. All four of the top leaders are the four names on this. So there's not a better way to start a bill in that way. So it's not necessarily going to be smooth sailing, but we feel like that's a really good way to kick this off. And again, it's always good when our legislative leaders want to work on something together. So the bill, I think Linda has made this point, this bill is not every single thing our commission recommended. I would say it is a start of some of the major recommendations that we think are important. We'll talk a little bit more about how this bill is funded, but just to be honestly candid, that the sort of three components of this bill are coming from some other special revenue funds at the Bureau of Insurance. And we felt like we needed to use them in a way that made sense. And I will say the Bureau Director will speak to this, that was consistent with the funds that had come in. There's no general fund money appropriated in this bill, but it is Bureau of Insurance funding for three different programs. So I'll give the quick overview and pass it off again to Bob. So the first component is to start the home resiliency program. We've talked a little bit. It's a recommendation of our report that people need more support in preparing their homes for the kinds of disasters Maine has seen. We talked about what Alabama had done, but this is a $15 million allocation and the language to start this new home resilience program. The next component is $12 million allocated to the Maine Emergency Management Agency. The bulk of that is the continued requirement for federal match for FEMA disaster recovery funds. So $10 million is going into just recovering from the disasters that we are still, I saw Shiloh on here, that Jay and Stonington and all the other communities in Maine are still working to rebuild their infrastructure and applying for this will apply the 25% state and local match for those FEMA funds. The two other things I think are important and exciting. One is to start a state match for the storm program. So this is a FEMA federal program that offers low interest loans to municipalities to do hazard mitigation projects. So Maine has not been able to compete for these funds yet. We didn't have the match. So this starts a $750,000 fund, as well as a staff person to start this. And then it invests in communications. And we've talked a lot in this commission about communications. I'll let Annie Fuchs from MEMA talk a little bit more about it, but just the need to invest in communication systems in emergencies is something that we heard a lot about in this commission. This is a huge down payment on doing that work. The last component is at MOCA, and Samantha Horn is here, our new MOCA director. She's going to talk about the work of the office. But we are investing in something we've talked about a lot here, data, floodplain management, a hub where people, communities, businesses can go for information about flood risks. So a couple of different components at the new MOCA office. including the establishment of the State Resilience Office, which is a project that we received NOAA funding for. But it will all go to significantly increase our capacity for data and management and reduction of flooding in the state of Maine. So 3 big things that are a big deal. I know the governor is very excited and bolstered by the work that this commission has done and the ability to put it to work in this bill. And I think, again, we will keep you all posted. I won't go into all the nitty gritty, but this bill was referred to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee then got 2 budget bills and said, this is really important. We should send it to a committee who has time and space to deal with it. So it has been re-referred to the Housing and Economic Development Committee. We understand it will be heard in a couple of weeks. We haven't seen that finally posted. But as soon as the public hearing is noticed, we will let this commission know, and we will certainly appreciate any and all support in ensuring its passage. It's an emergency bill, so we hope it's enacted quickly. That will allow the funds to be dispersed immediately, and for things like, the MEMA disaster recovery funds, some of the other work, it would be great to get going immediately. So I will stop talking. I will pass it off to Bob. And again, I really on behalf of the governor, want to thank this commission for the work that you put into these ideas that are now hopefully getting substantial funding, and we can get to work.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. Appreciate the opportunity. Just briefly, the first component of the bill is the home resiliency program. That's not a typo. The M and the E are capitalized for a reason. It's a $15 million appropriation or reallocation from a surplus that the Bureau of Insurance has accumulated over the past several years, literally from fees that are $30 or $45 per person. So there are hundreds of thousands of producers. These are brokers and agents, the vast majority of which do not reside in the state of Maine, but in order to sell insurance to Maine people, you have to have a license from the Bureau of Insurance. And these are literally fees that are $30 or $45, depending on what the fee is. So this is small potatoes. We have some of the lowest fees in the nation for producers and brokers, but we have literally hundreds of thousands of them that seek to sell insurance to Maine folks. So that's the source of the funding for pretty much the entire program. It's mainly one-time allocation or distribution. This is not, we built this up over time. This is not sort of recurring that we get, surplus built up. So we think this is an appropriate use of these funds. The home resiliency program, if you can just pop over to the next slide, Brian, it's a grant program for homeowners to help them, make their home more resilient in the event of storms, and also has a hook in lowering someone's insurance premiums, particularly the roof portion. There are really 2 pieces of this grant program that we're developing. One is roof replacement that complies with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety Fortified Standards, or IBHS. This is a nationally known program that essentially, if people are going to look to people need to put a new roof on, if they do it using under these fortified standards, there's a reduction in their homeowners insurance, and the roof is going to be longer lasting and be able to withstand, hurricane force winds and severe rain that we sometimes experience. It's modeled after a successful program in Alabama, of all places. So, to Hannah's point earlier, this is not a partisan issue. Alabama is hardly a blue state, and yet they have found that this is an important program for them, and it's been highly successful. We've modified it to deal with some of the perils that Maine deals with. So that's why we have flood resiliency as a component of it as well. Just on the next slide, the new roofing standards are established by a internationally recognized organization. This isn't going to require changes to the building code, although I would argue we should probably think seriously about that. and making sure that our communities have adopted the most up-to-date building codes. That's probably fodder for another conversation. Just in terms of what we see at the Bureau of Insurance in terms of non-renewals, so people who receive a notice that their roof is not up to spec, they can get canceled or non-renewed if they don't rebuild their roof. And so about 75% of the non-renewal notices that focus on the condition of the property, not like you didn't pay your premium, therefore you're not getting renewed, deal with the roof condition. We see it all the time. So we think this is a need, and we think that these funds can be useful to help people replace their roof in a more resilient fashion. The other piece is a flood resiliency. It's retrofitting electrical wiring or elevating sockets and switches. It might be sealing a foundation so it doesn't seep water. It could be installing French drains or other home modifications. So it's sort of a two-pronged program, one on upgrading roofs, and the other is on more resiliency for flood protection. Again, I'll remind the commission, flood and water damage from floods are not covered by your homeowner's insurance. So this is not like you're not going to get a reduction in your premium because you're not paying a premium to protect against floods. But obviously in this state with so many riverine communities and coastal communities, flood is a major problem for us that we need to deal with. So those are the two-pronged pieces of the program. The next slide just talks briefly about eligibility. This is focused on Maine residents and their primary residence. So this is not second homes. This is not condos in Sugarloaf, which probably need some support as well. But this program is geared towards Maine residents, their principal place of business. We think the maximum grant, given the funds that we have, would be about $15,000 per home. That covers not all of a roof replacement. That covers more than what would be needed to build it up to these fortified standards. So it'll pay for a portion of just your basic home roof repair, but also elevate that to a higher standard. It would also pay for, we think, quite a bit of flood resiliency. The initial thought is to roll it out in 2 or 3 regions of the state, make sure it's working, make sure we have the contractors that are certified by IBHS, not the state, to perform these types of roof upgrades and other flood resiliency, and then roll it out statewide shortly thereafter. A couple of points. The Alabama program is interesting because it's been in effect for about 10 years. They have just surpassed 50,000 homes that now have fortified roofs. 40,000 of those homes were done purely with private money. So just sort of the culture of resilience and knowing that this fortified roof can make a difference in your home surviving, torrential rains or winds, has convinced 40,000. So 4 out of 5 homes that have fortified roofs in Alabama were built without any state funds. So I just wanted to make that point. And then we are also working with the insurance community to make sure that people who do have these roofs built to this standard get some reduction in their premium. So that's the short version of a program we've been sort of pushing and noodling and working through the details on for the last 6 months. We greatly appreciate the governor's support for this.
It looks like there's a question from Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Bob, just a
You're
quick
on
question.
mute, Pete.
Is a eligible activity under the flood
You're
resilience?
still on mute.
No, he's good.
Can you hear me, Bob?
Yeah.
Okay. Is an eligible activity under the flood resiliency aspect elevating a structure? Like, in other words, can somebody take the 15,000, if that's a maximum grant amount, and put that towards the cost of elevating their structure? Would that be eligible under this?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't worked out all of the details on the flood side. The roof side is sort of an established standard, but that was one area we did look at. Obviously, that's super expensive, but we think that, anything that we can do to help Mainers, avoid having a flooded property is probably money well spent. So I would be interested in talking to you further and any other people on the commission or else other, otherwise who have thoughts about, what might be eligible for, particularly on the flood side, which is not, it's interesting, IBHS and other insurance institutes, they focus on insurable perils. And flood is like, yeah, that's NFIP's problem. So we don't worry about that. So any thoughts folks have on what might be eligible for flood resiliency, we'd be open to, certainly having a conversation about that.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
Okay, back to you, Hannah. I think unless there's any other questions, I'd be happy again. And folks, my email's online. You can get it through the BOI or send me a note. I'd be happy to jump on a call with you to talk further about this. So if you have any thoughts about, to Pete's point, what might be eligible for, particularly on the flood side.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And I think Brian was working. I know that Ann Fuchs from MEMA was not able to launch Zoom, so she's somewhere out there on the phone. And I see her as an attendee.
See. Anne, are you able to unmute and speak?
I think I just did it. Can you guys hear me?
There we go. We can. Thank you.
Ah, fantastic. Okay. All right, Hannah, would you like me to go right into my breakdown for communications, safeguarding, revolving loans, and disaster recovery fund at this time?
Yes, great.
Okay. Yeah, apologies to everybody. If there's a technical glitch to be had, I'm definitely having it this week. And for whatever reason, I just can't seem to launch Zoom. So I apologize for not being with you visually, but I'll try to restart everything after giving this brief out and hopefully join you guys shortly. But to kind of dive in, I was asked just to give a bit more information on some of the components of LD1 as they pertain to Maine Emergency Management Agency. And I'll start first with the communications improvements. So Hannah gave a great high-level briefing. We've, again, learned from the November report applied to the governor from the State of Maine's Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission that emergency communications was a big kind of after action area, an area for improvement from the December and January storms. And not big news for Maine Emergency Management Agency. We only have one statewide interoperability coordinator that oversees the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, or IPAWS. So there's plenty of opportunity for the state to invest and improve emergency communications. So specifically what LD1 is asking for, with huge support from MEMA, is $800,000 to close gaps in emergency communications. And in addition to that, one proposed limited period position to support emergency communications. So it's kind of building out our staff to support this. So in essence, there are technical gaps in the languages that we can actually offer alerts in right now. We need to make improvements there. Equipment gaps that prevent us from localizing alerts, and training gaps as well in how alerting systems work in Maine. So we're hearing a lot from after the December and January storms, how a lot of communities are investing in subscription-based warning systems, alerting and warning systems, which is a good thing, but it only gets to the populations that actually are aware of these subscriber-based platforms, and number two, subscribe to them. So you're missing enormous populations. So investments in emergency communications, in essence, allows us to build out technical assistance and offer county partners and local partners as well more awareness on what exactly the Integrated Public Alerting and Warning System, or IPAWS system, is. And it's FEMA's national system for local alerting that provides authenticated emergency life-saving information to the public through mobile phones, using wireless emergency alerts, to radio and television via the emergency alert system, and also through NOAA's weather radio system as well. So lots of opportunity to invest in emergency communications, and we're very happy to see this move forward in LD1, based especially on what we're hearing from communities from the December and January storms. So moving next into Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund. The Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund was signed into law from President Trump back in 2020, and it was in essence an opportunity for the federal government, or FEMA, to allow states to apply for grants between the state and FEMA to essentially build out a self-sustaining revolving loan fund at the state level. So it's something that's been on our list of desires since we kicked off Maine Climate Council back in 2019, 2020, and was reflected in our recommendations and actions in our last 4-year action plan. So we're very proud to support this as well, with a proposed $750,000 to jumpstart this revolving loan fund for mitigation projects. So this allocation essentially provides the state match for a federal grant from the federal Safeguarding Tomorrow revolving loan fund, which inherently provides capital to states, like the state of Maine, to establish revolving loan funds that provide hazard mitigation assistance to local governments to reduce risks from natural hazards and disasters. And this program is built to be complementary to all other hazard mitigation assistance grant opportunities under the FEMA umbrella. So it would offer another opportunity for another route, maybe outside of a bond or something like that, where interest from the loan is not to exceed 1%. We haven't had staffing at Maine Emergency Management Agency to be able to support building out and creating this program and bringing it to the state of Maine successfully. So another portion of LD1 is the inclusion of one limited period position to support building out this revolving loan fund, the grant between MEMA and FEMA, and inherently how the state of Maine runs this between the state and subrecipient. The fiscal year 25 Safeguarding Tomorrow revolving loan fund notice of funding opportunity was announced, I believe, just last week. And for this grant cycle, $178 million is available to apply for. And the application period, we're luckier this time around than we have been in previous fiscal years, is going to remain open from January 14th, which was the release of the notice of funding opportunity, through September 30th, 2025. So we'll be monitoring this very closely in hopes that we're able to successfully onboard a limited period position to help us build this program out while simultaneously applying. And then the last thing I was asked to cover was disaster recovery funds. This one's very near and dear to my heart. It's a daily conversation I have with my leadership. We've had a lot of damaging events in the state of Maine over the last several years, and we still have, as of today, a total of 12 open, one closing shortly. So we'll still actively be working 11 major disaster declarations from 2017 to present. So the state, by Title 37B, has statutory obligations to provide up to 15% cost share for declared disasters. So that's 75% federal, 15% state, and a 10% local match. And that inherently takes 100% of disaster recovery fiscal responsibilities off that local entity and puts a large cost share across our federal partners and, of course, us as well with our 15% state cost share. This is aside from COVID, which has different cost shares, just a caveat there. So the proposed $10 million in the disaster recovery fund is inherently meant to assist Maine communities that have been impacted by previous disasters or even disasters yet to come. There is no standing pot of money that we simply get a trickle down, or there's no guarantee that we'll have funding at any point in the disaster recovery fund. We have to ask for it. And so this inherently aligns us or sets us up for success in meeting our obligations to ensure Maine communities do not see any delays in reimbursements once obligated from our federal partners. I believe that's all I have, pending any questions.
Great, thank you, Anne. That was perfect. Good,
Great, thank you.
good lead into Brian and Brett, who are gonna talk about all of the work of the State Resilience Office. Although Linda's got her hand raised, so I'll
Yeah.
stop talking.
Well, just one quick question, Anne and we're Hannah. The one-time funding for the disaster recovery funds, are we saying, yeah, I may have missed this, that we have not been able to actualize these particular FEMA recovery funds in the past? Or why is this match now coming from this location as opposed to another part of the budget? Just curious.
I mean, I will say actually the supplemental budget is currently being heard in appropriations as well, and there is an additional couple $1 million allocated for this same fund. So I will say that we never have enough money for disaster recovery, and the disasters over the last couple of years are piling up. And so frankly, in a constrained budget environment, funding this storm recovery is urgent, and it is being funded both in the supplemental budget and in this bill.
Yeah,
And
great.
there have been allocations. There's no ongoing source of funding for this fund. It actually has a statutory cap of $15 million. So it's not, in this world of many, many disasters, that might be a policy question we look at, whether or not that cap should be raised and should there be some sort of ongoing allocation. But Annie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would just say my understanding is it's more like, oh, we had a disaster, we should allocate some money for the state match to the FEMA funds. So Annie, please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think, Hannah, I think you're spot on. And I just think, you know, historically, looking back, let's say over the last decade, Maine hasn't seen as the frequency in disasters we're seeing now. And so it really hasn't come to fruition as much as it has now as to, you know, why we don't have like a standard pot of money ready to go for our 15% cost share. So we've gained a lot of momentum in the last couple of years through the Maine Climate Council platform, through this platform, in ensuring that, you know, there's no gaps when it comes to reimbursements for Maine communities that have been affected by disasters. So Hannah's right. Everything she said is absolutely correct. I think we're just kind of growing as we start to see more disasters happen more frequently.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask just another question along the same lines. And how do other states, and I may have missed this, how do other states fund their match? Do they have a regular line item in their budget? Is it an annual bill that is created? What lessons should we learn? And because I think that would be really important to put in our report, a recurring line item somewhere. And it'd be nice to know where that somewhere is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. And my response, I'll keep it high level for now because I can't give exact references to, let's say, the state of Florida or California and how exactly they do it. The resource tax heavy states are able to supplement funds and maintain a consistent coffer for disasters. Florida, for example, they know they're going to get hit. They know they have to be prepared. Therefore, their approach has been a little bit different than ours. Ultimately, every state does things differently. And so I think the appropriate response to this question is going to take a little bit of research. And I'm happy to do that, to research and across different states, see how these coffers are funded and consistently maintained so that we can review potential best practice for the state of Maine moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really important for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think, you know, we may be asked, we may ask ourselves, do we want to be as overt in our final proposal? We've kind of alluded to it in the interim, that we know that we are more vulnerable now than we have been, and we're going to hear from Sam in a moment. I think our vulnerability goes up every year. We can certainly acknowledge we are not a, you know, as you said, a tax heavy state. But I do think we have to point out that, you know, if we want to be resilient, we have to fund resiliency somehow. And we also know it's not going to all come from the feds. And, you know, we know that the state only has revenue from one source. So I think really knowing how other people, particularly if there are states that are sort of like Northeast states like Vermont, who we've modeled a little after. I don't know whether they have a fund, but if they do, be interested to know how they've accumulated it over time. And I think we should be very specific in our recommendations around that.
Especially
Yeah.
because one of our recommendations is about, you know, accessing, not leaving funds on the table. And one of our, I think our biggest agencies that we're talking about that with is FEMA. So that was what raised my question about the one-time funding, honestly.
No, I think this is a great, it's an excellent question to go ask these other states. And I think this is a great area for this commission to kind of dig into a little more.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, yeah, it'd make our lives a lot easier, you know, if we had funding ready to go. And I think I'm a little biased, but of the utmost importance. So I'm very happy to research this with my team and bring a little bit more information back to the group at large for the next meeting.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So are we ready to meet Samantha?
We have Brian is going to give us a little bit more, and I am just going to tell you all I have to go down to the Environment Committee. So passing off to Brian to just finish up.
Great.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. So yeah, I'll quickly cover the third component of LD1, which is the establishment of a state resilience office at the Maine Office of Community Affairs and funding for a new initiative called Flood Ready Maine. So the State Resilience Office at MoCA will coordinate implementation of the state's activities that are designed to improve resilience to weather-related events and climate change, collaborate with state agencies and municipalities, tribal governments, and regional councils, promote natural hazard risk management across all levels of government, and assist communities and regions to manage flooding, storms, and other natural hazards. The State Resilience Office is funded for 5 years through the state's $69 million grant from NOAA. So we're really fortunate to have a source of initial funding for this office. The federal funding will support 4 positions, including a director, a senior planner, a regional coordinator, and a communications coordinator. So a lot of the roles that were envisioned in the 12 recommendations we made last fall. And related to this bill, the Resilience Office will lead the Flood Ready Maine initiative, which aims to improve the quality and access to flood risk information. So LD1 puts over $5 million into updating flood models and flood maps, creating an online data hub for flood information, and building a consumer-oriented flood risk communication tool similar to the Buyers Aware platform in Texas that we've heard from Sam Brody about several times. And then lastly, LD1 creates new regional capacity for floodplain management. It will fund positions and trainings for certified floodplain managers at each of Maine's 10 regional councils and councils of government. And these positions will help communities communicate about their flood risk, undertake activities and projects to reduce flood risk, and improve participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. And sort of just to wrap up this, the whole LD1 piece, taken together, LD1 implements activities related to at least 5 of the Commission's 12 interim recommendations. So as Linda said, this is a start. It's an important start that touches a lot of the work that we discussed over the last 7 months. There's still more to go and still more work for this Commission. But we're really pleased that the governor has latched on to our ideas and is moving them forward. And so since much of this work will be housed at the Maine Office of Community Affairs, we've invited Samantha Horn to tell us about that office and the processes underway through the state budget to bring all of the programs together under that roof. So I will turn it over to Samantha.
Good afternoon, everyone, and nice to meet those of you who I haven't met before. Brian tells me that you have heard a fair amount about the beginnings of MoCA and what the point is of MoCA, so I'm going to sort of jump in the middle of the story. So can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So MoCA, as you know, is a combination of programs that are proposed to be created and programs that are proposed to be moved. So you've just heard all about the programs that are proposed to be created. And then here's a list of the ones that aren't in existence in state government today and are proposed to be moved. So housing opportunity, municipal planning, the CRP program, floodplain, coastal program, volunteer Maine, and the code enforcement program. And those programs are moved in the biennial budget Part D. So if you want any of the language or the funding levels, you that's where to look is Part D. And if you have any questions about those as you go forward, just let me know and I'll walk through any of it with you. Okay, next slide, please. So what I understand you wanted to hear about today was vision, what we've learned in the recent budget process, and thoughts, plans, challenges. So here's the vision part. Here's what I think are the opportunities behind this office, bringing together those existing programs and the proposed programs. I think we can provide a one-stop shop for communities. When I've spoken with communities, municipal leaders, a lot of what I've heard is, we just want you to pick up the phone and get us to where we need to go in state government without needing to call many people or be passed around a phone tree. So a one-stop shop for helping people understand how they can get to the person they need or the program they need quickly and easily is a really important component of this. Another important component is aligning incentives and policies. And it's all to get to our shared goals more easily and with better effect. And so there are many programs that are revolving around community planning, community resilience, and we can combine some of them so that there are fewer entry points, fewer applications to make. We can align them behind the scenes so that they better accomplish policy goals on a more consistent basis. And really, there's actually some of that going on already, discussions between programs about how some of those opportunities can be consolidated or made easier to apply for. I think we've seen strides in that direction. For instance, the CRP program really is a pretty low barrier program, and I think it's a great model, as I think you've all pointed out as well. And then reducing administrative burden on communities and service providers. We know that especially for lower capacity communities, just finding out about grants or programs can be a tough enough lift, let alone applying for them and then administering them. And we recognize that communities can do more with the resources they have if there's less paperwork to do and more time to do the actual project. And then on the right, I won't read these two, but there are some things that we're exploring that have come up in discussions. And because we're still months away from being together as an organization, I don't want to commit to any of this. We really have a lot of good work to do as a staff because there's a lot of wisdom in the staff. But the Climate Council, your commission, the governor has already laid down a good foundation for us to work with. And I think that as staff, when we put our heads together, we follow the blueprint that you all have been working on. We're going to find a lot of opportunities to improve service to communities. And frankly, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we can tackle the tough stuff also. Next slide, please. So what have I learned in the last few months from trying to pull this together? I'm a staff of one right now. And so I've been exposed to all aspects of starting up a new office in state government. And I've been pleased to find that within the state, the programs that are going to come together, there's actually not a lot of overlap or duplication of effort, which is good to see. We haven't been having multiple programs do the same thing, but there is a lot of connecting that we can do that's not currently happening. Some of the staff haven't met each other in some of these programs. And so really we could be making a lot of connections across programs. I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be understanding and making visible networks. So really good work is being done both inside and outside of state government by a really wide array of organizations. And we don't want to suppress or ignore, or, we want to be in full partnership with the folks that are doing that good work. But we have to know in a consistent way that we can make visible to ourselves and to other people who's doing what and how to do warm handoffs to other programs that are better suited to help communities, how to share resources with programs that could take the ball and run with it, and coming up with a systematic way to make those networks visible and approachable is going to be one of our key challenges and something we're going to be thinking a lot about. And another thing it's becoming really apparent is that we're going to have programs with lots of grant activity, both incoming and especially outgoing grant activity. And so we're going to need strong administrative support. There are 2 admin positions proposed in the biennial budget, and those are going to be really key for us to be functional as an office. All right, next slide. So quickly, these are conservative timelines, but I think that we may be able to accelerate it a little bit, but just to give you a sense of what the next year looks like for us. We're just in the process of hiring permission for the State Resilience Office staff. We should have that in the next month. And then we'll go right to posting for that. And so we should have the State Resilience Office staff on board in the May or June timeline. We may be able to get the director position on board sooner. We're just going to have to see how fast we can push the state hiring system. The other programs, if the legislature agrees to move them, that would take effect July 1. And then we'd be beginning services to communities in our new form in the summer. We may hire for the flood ready Maine positions in the fall, or it could be sooner. If LD1 is an emergency bill and we can get it rolling sooner, then we'll certainly hire those as quickly as we can. And then by December, I think at least by December, perhaps sooner, we'll be fully staffed as an office and we'll be up and running. Next slide, please. And then sort of thoughts, plans, challenges with regard to the implementation of LD1 and the NOAA grant. I've thought about what it is that is going to be key in implementing the LD1 and NOAA, so effectively the State Resilience Office. And these are things that occurred to me. Maintaining transparency so that we can manage expectations for folks, identify opportunities, and build trust. I think if people can see what it is we're planning and implementing, they'll be better able to participate in helping create that and understanding what their piece of the puzzle is. Investing in sustainable data delivery products and practices that will outlive the grant and OSR funding. I think because there's a little bit of a federal funding boost lately, and as Bob was saying, these OSR funds are primarily one-time funds. Looking at longevity and how we can maintain systems, even if the funding bubble from the feds and the OSR accounts pass us by, I think is going to be key, so that we don't end up with a dip in the near after the funding runs out. Keeping low resource communities top of mind at all times, so that if we build something that will work for a low resource community, it'll be easier to then also make that work for a community that has higher resources, but probably not the other way around. We can't have one size fits all solutions. We really need to make that work for everybody. And so keeping it top of mind, the communities that have the fewest resources, I think is going to be key. Just going in with a problem solving mindset and then prioritizing building local capacity. So the municipalities and other communities will have the ability to sustain themselves going forward. So just this top of mind, what's coming up for me in this implementation process. And then I think that's the last slide, Brian, isn't it? Yeah. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know we're just about at the time for this segment. So if you have questions but would rather ask them offline, I'm happy to talk with you anytime.
Super. Thanks, Samantha. We might have time for one or two questions for Samantha or for any of the other speakers, and then I'll hand it back to Dan and Linda.
Brian, can I just say hooray? That's all I want to say.
Of course. Thanks, Judy. Great. Linda?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And I was going to second Judy. I think that the Office of Community Affairs and the consolidation of these community-based programs is really good news, especially for small towns like my own and others. So welcome to Samantha, and thank you for leading this effort along with the team at GoPIF and others. Really much appreciated. And thanks, a special thanks, I think, has to go out to Bob Carey for being innovative with revenue and funding for these initiatives. That is huge. That's what's making LD1 possible. Thank you so much, Bob. And Anne, thank you for your good summary, and Brian, of the different programs in LD1. I am tremendously excited about LD1, and I hope everybody else on screen with me is as well. And I hope that we share that excitement with our legislators and move this through to completion. All of that cheerleading said, I now want to introduce Sam Brody and Wes Highfield from our consulting group, Harpswell 10, that we've been working with very happily throughout the course of this program. It's part of why we've been able to make some of the strides we've been able to make, is because we've had their good examples, their guidance, and there's now their data starting to back us. And as we know, a good foundation in data is really what's going to help to move the needle on some of these issues. So Sam and Wes are going to talk to us about current risk data available in Maine, gaps and needs, the planned analyses, and give examples from other states that have developed these types of partnerships for long-term analytical capabilities. And we will have a discussion after this. So we look forward to hearing from Sam and Wes. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Linda, Dan, Brian, Hannah, and team for your continued support. Wes, do you want to, can Wes have screen sharing capabilities, or do you want me to do it?
I got it.
So we're going to build on our previous conversation about data and provide the results of our data gap analysis for Maine, which is generally really good news. Talk about how that stems into our recommendations. And then talk about the specific analyses, particularly Dr. Highfield on this call has done since our last meeting, to give you a taste of what is possible based on what Maine has, and discuss where we can go from here. Next slide. So I'm just going to give a super brief introduction, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Highfield, and then I'll come back later at the end of the presentation. Just to reiterate what Linda just mentioned, data is the foundation for all good resiliency decisions, whether that's planning, recovery, response, and even communication. So for situation awareness driven by good data analytics is what's going to lead to the success of all your programs and proposals. That being said, Maine is in pretty good shape with existing data sets. What Maine can do now as the next step is to think about how to integrate and analyze these data to develop tools that support resilient decisions. The leading organizations in this country around hazard mitigation and resiliency in general have that data edge, right? That is the core to their success. And I think if Maine wants to lean into being a front runner in the resiliency space, not just what data it has, but its analytical capabilities and initiatives to take those analytics and serve them up in a way that is understandable and actionable to decision makers at all levels, from individual all the way up to the governor, is essential. So with that said, I'm going to turn over to Wes, who's going to paint the data landscape for you and show you some of the most recent products we've produced. Wesley.
Wes, before you start, can you just swap your presenter view? We're seeing two screens here simultaneously.
Yes. Better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sam. Sorry about that. So part of my task over the last couple of weeks has been to go through basically an inventory of data of kind of the minimum standards that you would need to conduct risk analyses, to delineate new floodplains, to assess vulnerabilities and exposures to flooding in the state of Maine. And so again, these are kind of minimal in terms of requirements, but this is what I have come up with during this data gap analysis. So I've broken this up into essentially 4 conceptual areas and given them a green, yellow, red color code. And as you can see, by and large, state of Maine is doing great. I know you see some red here. Let's not get too concerned about that just yet. I'm going to go over these by category, but I was thoroughly impressed with what was there already and the inventory and provenance of these data sets. So future analyses, we'll see some of this today. This is generally what we're working on for the final report to help inform those recommendations and inform kind of the flood risk landscape or status, if you will, across several different dimensions. So we're going to go over some of this floodplain map status and ages today. That's, I think, pretty interesting, and also tie in some of these structure inventory variables. All right, so let's talk about natural features for a little bit.
Hey, Wes, could I ask
Yes.
one quick question?
Of course.
What we hear a lot, and this is coming from a layperson, we hear a lot about the FEMA floodplain maps. Where do they fit in this? And are they made up of a compilation of a lot of these various different data sets, or is it a separate?
Yes.
So how does that, because that's really, I
perfect
think
segue. Perfect segue, Dan.
Okay, great.
So when a lot of this does deal with the development of hydrologic and hydraulic models, which is the basis for FEMA floodplains and any other flood risk product. That's what's going to give you recurrence intervals and a spatial representation of where those floodplains are. And so we kind of start with natural features here because that is the basis for developing these, we call them H&H models, right? The big one here is going to be elevation data. And so the higher the resolution and the more recent that elevation data is, the better those H&H models should be in theory. This screenshot here is LiDAR, so light detection and ranging. It's the development of very high resolution topography and elevation data based on airplanes that fly with lasers, which sounds pretty cool. Doing great. I mean, we got to remember that so the darker these colors, the more recent. There's statewide coverage, which a lot of states don't have, period. And most of this is pretty recent. So from a topographical or an elevational perspective, natural features look really good. I did color it yellow because some of this is starting to be dated a little bit. But by and large, you're in a much better position than other places are. There's statewide LiDAR, which is great. Previous to this, we would have relied upon USGS digital elevation models, which are a much lower resolution and pretty coarse. So in really good shape here. All the hydrology's there, all the land cover's there. You would use the land cover, to your point, Dan, when you're developing these developing floodplains to get at roughness coefficients and impervious surfaces. So that's all there. All of the open space and protected areas are there in spades, both a Maine developed one as well as a federal one. Soils are available nationwide, so that gets you infiltration rates and other soil characteristics necessary to delineate a floodplain. And there's brand new, relatively new precipitation, rainfall duration intervals that National Weather Service has developed, and these are, at least for most of the country, somewhat hot off the presses. Prior to this, we were relying on stuff from the 70s and 80s. So these are more recent rainfall duration probabilities. When we get into flood risk products, which is, you know, if we take the basis of a lot of this and start to develop these flood risk products like floodplains, kind of have a mixed bag here, if you will. The first one that we looked at was SLOSH. SLOSH stands for Sea, Land, and Overland Surge from Hurricanes. This is a predictive layer of, given a storm, like Cat 3 coming from this direction, this is how deep the water would be from a surge perspective. That's all there. It's relatively recent, 2018. So that's a good basis. In addition to SLOSH, there's also models called ADCIRC, which stands for Advanced Circulation. This is a much more recent approach and a much more accurate approach at predicting surge levels from hurricanes. There is no ADCIRC-based surge prediction data for the state of Maine. That said, DOT is in the process of developing that, and it should be out, based on what I've read, this year. So it's in the works, it's coming, and using that for leverage to develop better coastal floodplains and coastal risk products should be top of mind when it's finally released. There's been a lot of discussion about the floodplains and the age of the floodplains, and that's the map that you're seeing here. I've oriented everything by decade. It's kind of a mixed bag, and we'll dig into this a little bit more. The coastal areas seem to have fairly recent coverage, which makes sense. They're typically much higher risk. As we move more landward and get into more of these riverine areas, you're going to see a little bit more variation there, and some of it is really old. 80s, 90s, you know, we're really starting to get, they're old products. They're based on old, lower resolution data. There's certainly been some development that's occurred around those areas, an increase in impervious surface. So those should probably be prioritized in terms of what should be remapped next. That said, I forget the number, but it was like 95% of the state where people actually live does have some form of floodplain coverage. So it's really a matter of remapping what's there and not necessarily recreating or redelineating areas that haven't been mapped before. Did miss that one. So structures and attributes. You can't really have risk if you don't know what's exposed, and that's where we get into the importance of these structures and attributes. Everything is great here, except for one thing that is red, which is first floor elevations. So National Inventory of Dams is in good shape. You have your own data layer of Maine dams, which is far better than what the feds have put out in terms of the national inventory. What you're looking at here is a example of a national structure inventory, which I've pulled down for Maine. This is a point level data set for every structure in the state, which is a very powerful tool for a lot of communities to use. And in addition to that, the statewide parcel data and associated building footprints are great. Everything's in good shape there. Two versions of critical infrastructure exist. There's one for the state developed by MEMA, and one that can be assembled from DHS. That's probably a place there. Everything's there, but I think there probably needs to be a conversation around what is considered critical infrastructure and if things can be added to that, or maybe in rural areas something is critical that it's not in an urban area. So I think there probably needs to be a discussion around that, but it's all generally there. And there's also a database of state-owned assets that can be used to assess risk to state-owned assets, but also tie in a little bit with that critical infrastructure. What you see here in red is first floor elevations. And this is red because it doesn't exist. North Carolina is the only state that I know of. There may be other ones that have a statewide database of first floor elevations. And I think it's important to talk about what I mean when I say first floor elevations. So as water comes up, that elevation at which it's going to enter a home. Think about it as the front door. If it's slab on grade, that could be 0, right? But if it's up on piers, it could be quite a bit higher. It's aspirational. It really should be, in terms of risk and assessing flood risk, it's really important because then you can start to develop estimated damage, right? When the water is going to come in. So with 2 feet of water above that, it's really important from risk. So that should be something that the state should probably think about. Sociodemographic data, it is all there. It is good. That's an easy one. Census provides actually pretty good data for the nation, for that matter. And there's 2 versions of social vulnerability out there. The one on the left was developed by Pitt Bowden and TNC. So that is a custom-made social vulnerability measure for the state, and one that should probably be maintained and used because it is really well done. It is very thoughtful in its attempt to capture unique characteristics of Maine. What you see on the right is the Centers for Disease Control, their social vulnerability. You can tell it's a little, the Maine is a far better product to use in this situation than the CDC. So we have some recommendations based on this data gap analysis. Most of them are pretty straightforward and probably not going to surprise anyone here. The first of these is to work on revising floodplains. That was in the interim report and covers recommendations 4 and 6. And aside from that, really develop a prioritization scheme based on the ages of the maps, population, land cover, potential development. I've started a draft work of this, and we'll run through it real quick if I have time. The second of these is leverage the work of the DOT for those AdCert runs. That coastal flood risk model, that's going to be, I think, a real boon in terms of data availability for coastal areas. There was some discussion about additional stream gauges. This is good for warning. This is good for understanding flood risk with better coverage of data. That should be considered. That was also in the interim report, but trying to determine the optimal places to put those, as well as the funding behind putting them in. Again, critical facilities. I struggle with this a little bit because there are 2 data sets out there, but I think there probably needs to be some thoughtfulness in determining what critical really is for some communities versus others. First floor elevations. This is again aspirational, but it really lays the groundwork for doing accurate damage assessment and scenarios down the road. And finally, a single location for authoritative hazard and disaster data. The state of Maine is data rich when it comes to data. It's just not necessarily all in the same place. And so that would be a huge first step at getting everything in one place, defining it as authoritative, keeping it updated as new products come out. Maine Geospatial Library is an excellent resource. Even before I started working with you all, when I taught geographic information systems, I would send my kids to your portal to come up with their own ideas because it was so comprehensive. So it's a great resource. MEMA doesn't appear to have any representation on their committees, and that might be a good idea to consider in terms of centralizing all of those data sets. So very briefly, I have started an attempt to kind of look at prioritizing where to remap, and not necessarily to create new maps, but prioritizing where to put those new maps. I've initially landed on 4 kind of conceptual areas to consider when trying to identify those areas. The first is structures in and near the floodplain, and I say near because a lot of these are old. The floodplains may have expanded, so these are all structures within the 100-year and 500-year floodplain. Also going to look at the age of the map. That comes from NFIP status, and you saw a visual of that earlier. Also looking at development change. There's a few ways to go about this. Maine is very unique in that they have this excellent and novel resource called DevTrack. DevTrack tracks electrical connections for both residential and commercial structures. So it's a count of electrical connections at a pretty high resolution on a grid that's within many communities. So it's really a unique way to track what's been turned on and as a proxy for increased development, perhaps. And finally, looking at insured damage from NFIP, but not insured damage in a floodplain, specifically insured damage that occurs and claims that occurred outside of an existing floodplain. So that's a signal that yes, the property owner knew that there was a risk despite being outside of the floodplain. Therefore, that's probably another spot that should be looked at. So the first of these, the unit of analysis, the little boxes you see, are communities, and they're a special type of community. They are a FEMA community, so they can be cities, towns, unincorporated townships. They use their own kind of geography, but this is what we're looking at. So this first one is quintiles of structure counts located in the 100 and 500-year floodplain. What do I mean by quintiles? Well, instead of just looking at counts for everything, we take those counts and then break them up into five groups based on the percentiles. That gives us a way to look kind of apples to apples as we look across all 4 of these dimensions and visually compare the measures. So at-risk structures, 5 being the worst, obviously, basically in the 100 to 80% range, and as you go down. And I don't think this image is going to surprise anyone, right? Coastal tends to get the most, and then basically just lots of variation depending on how urban it is. This is the DevTrack data. So this is looking at, again, quintiles, so apples to apples, number of electrical connection counts by community, 2009 to 2021, kind of a rolling average. This data set unfortunately stops in 2021 that I could locate. So there is a little bit of a gap there. But this gives you a sense, again, apples to apples of those quintiles, where you're seeing an increase in electrical connections. When we look at map age, this is very similar to what you looked at before when we were talking about flood risk products. But again, put into quintiles so that we can compare apples to apples. By and large, doing really well on the coastal areas. As we get up here to these riverine areas, not so much. And finally, NFIP claim counts. These are 500-year floodplain, at least 500 or completely out, right? They're out of the 100-year, they're out of a special flood hazard area. And again, quintiles of those counts so that we're apples to apples. Kind of start to see a trend here, don't you? Probably not surprising, but quite a bit of variation here. Coastal tends to grab the most, and then some pockets up at the top. So the intent of doing this, of putting everything into quintiles, is to, again, get everything on the same page. I could have added all these together to come up with an additive index, but that's very subjective, and I didn't really feel like it was my place to add in that subjectivity. Things could be weighted different ways. Maybe map age is weighted 5 times as important as something else. I don't know, but that's a very subjective way to look at things. So something for you all to discuss amongst yourselves. But I will leave you in the interest of time with one last map. And thank you all for listening to me talk. I enjoy talking data and spatial data and maps. So this is a lot of fun for me. This one takes a little concentration. This is bivariate. So what you're seeing across this vertical right here is the age of the map, the age of the floodplain map. What you are seeing across the horizontal here is the number of housing units. So really trying to find and pick out locations where the map age is really low and the housing units are really high. Excuse me, the map age is really high, housing units are really high. So top right-hand corner, this deep red are areas where the maps are really old and the housing units are relatively very high. You catch a lot of this in the orange down here on these coastal areas. These maps are relatively new, but since the number of structures is so high, they tend to pop out a little bit more. The more I looked at this, the more this could be fairly instructive as an approach. And these could be substituted. We could look at map age and claims outside. I mean, there's lots of different relationships that we could look there. So I'm over time. Thanks for listening to me. Happy to answer questions. Happy to delve as deep as you all would like to into these preliminary analyses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wes. And Sam, were you going to add anything to close here before we go to question and answers?
Yeah, Wes, amazing stuff. My one caution that shows up in Wes's maps is, I know we're all interested in updating the FEMA floodplains and using that to make better decisions, but an increasing amount of impact is occurring outside those floodplains. In some places, the majority. And so as urbanization occurs, the percent of out of and sometimes miles outside the floodplain boundaries receive impacts. And so, over focusing on the FEMA floodplains to make resilience decisions could bite you in the end. I can talk about other, Brian asked me to talk about some of these other state examples, but I feel like addressing questions first is the way to go. Brian, what do you think?
Yep, I'll defer to Linda, but I think that's a good idea.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's take a couple questions, and then if we have some time, Sam, you can add that information. I just Wes, that last map in particular was fascinating, and for non-data people like myself, I think very communicative, and I think that's what we're looking for, right? Is how to communicate the impact of some of this. So before, I've got a couple people with their hands up for questions, but Dan, I see you also have something you want to add. What's that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask a question and apologize. I can't find raise your hand on this for some reason, but I kind of two questions. One, Wes, just interesting, because I am a data guy and I love this stuff. And a couple of those maps relate to kind of risk and insurance claims or claims.
Correct.
And what would be an interesting map, and it may be relatively easy to figure out, would be an overlay on availability of insurance. Because, you know, there's vast parts of the state where it doesn't look like there are many claims, but there may not be many claims because there's no availability, either because of product or affordability by
Right.
homeowners. So, you know, the question I have is how much of the state is actually covered by insurance?
That would be really quick and easy to do. So
Yeah.
all of those communities, let me put this back up so it's.
And you're just talking about flood insurance, right, Dan? In this
I'm talking
instance?
about, well, flood insurance or disaster in general,
Flood
um,
insurance would be relatively easy because
because that's FEMA.
what we're looking at right here, for example, are quote unquote FEMA communities. And
Wes,
they
we're
could
not seeing your screen yet.
oh, I'm on a roll today.
Yeah. There you go.
There we go. So I can color code. Basically, it's whether you participate in the NFIP or not.
Yeah.
So if you participate, then flood insurance is available. The other insurance products, I'd have to give some thought.
Well,
Especially-
virtually all communities are NFIP participating.
Right. There's only a few that don't. So
Yeah. And they're like got 6 people in them.
yeah.
And property insurance is available everywhere,
Everywhere.
but it doesn't cover flood. So there'd be no claims.
Well, well, we're not talking about, this is flood, but we're talking about resilience in general, and resilience really does go beyond flood. You know,
Yeah, we have data. We should talk. I apologize for jumping in. The Bureau of Insurance collects data on incidents of claims down to I think we're down to the zip code level. So we should talk about the data that we're collecting and how it might be useful for Sam and Wes and the team that are building these maps.
Excellent.
yeah.
And it does
And-
seem to me that this particular presentation was focused mostly on flood. So I agree with you, Dan, that we have other kinds of disasters, including wildfire disaster, that we need to kind of account for. But I think these particular maps are focused on flood damage. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was and you hit on the point that, you know, resilience is not just about floods. And quite frankly, you know, one would, if you looked at the claims on the coast of Maine, you know, I would not know what the number is, but, you know, during those 2 storms, there was both flood and there was wind. And wind is covered by totally different insurance than flood. So, and that's often the argument between the adjusters. So,
Yes, because in
I-
fact, the wind-driven ocean damage was not covered. So.
yeah, so that's kind of maybe really understanding the dynamics of, and it gets me to the other observation that I think, Brian, we should just keep as a placeholder. You know, when I helped New York State over, you know, on the rebuild after Sandy, which was a huge hurricane, one of the things we identified was that there were a number of building code things that were easy to change, that could be good mitigants. So for instance, and we actually have now found this in the building we own in Thomaston that got a lot of flooding last year, was the elevation of the electrical service entrance. And our entrance was flooded out, and there was and then, you know, we kind of had to go to, in that case, it was CMP, and request them to raise it. And we couldn't raise it until we raised the ground, which required a permit, but which we got, and now we've raised the ground and they've raised the service. But to me, there's an easier fix than that, because that then required the town of Thomaston and all sorts of other things, you know, to get service, whether it's for electric or gas or you know, other things to a height where you're sort of, and this is for new or renovated things, but to really mine through the building codes and try to mitigate, Wes, some of the things you call first floor.
Right.
which are easy because you don't have to raise a building to raise an electric service, or you don't have to raise a building to raise a gas service. And maybe people could be encouraged to raise up their heat pumps, when they're putting them outside the building, out of the floodplain, as just the natural course of doing things.
And code for building underneath the NFIP. So if the base flood was 5 foot, then the first floor should be at least 5 feet, but all the mechanical has to be elevated to that level too.
Great, thank you, Dan, for those good comments. And Wes, Dr. Va, you've had your hand up. And Wes, can you please stop sharing your screen now?
Well, thank you so much, Wes, for that data review. I really appreciate it. I think as you were going through it, I was trying to think like for the public, how do you translate this information? How do you digest this information? How does it impact action? And I say that because as you're going through, I'm recognizing, oh, I see, especially in that last map, you're overlaying map age with the number of housing units, right? So immediately I can sort of see, like, what does that really mean? It means that you have the most housing units in this area, but if the map age is old, then maybe one intervention could be, updating that. So I would love to get your sense of, like, how would you translate each of those maps and how do they relate to one another?
The translation part is interesting because that's truly risk communication, right? And that's the lever that has to be flipped for individual action. Communicating that, in my opinion, and I'm biased, communicating that to me is a much more higher resolution exercise than what we just looked at right now. That's a community level, household level, neighborhood level type of product to communicate that better. Everybody identifies much better with their local community and their street and their neighborhood than they probably do with a statewide map. So it's really drilling down at a household level to communicate that.
And we like to think about this as a phased process. There's the data, which Maine has. There's the way the data is put together in an integrated way that Wes gave a sample of. And then it's communicating that data and those visualizations in a way that's interpretable and actionable. And each one of those phases has its own complications and opportunities. But what I would envision for Maine is all three of those phases are interconnected and draw from each other.
Yeah, thank you for that question and for those responses. Sam Roy, you've got a question.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
So Dr. Va, I really appreciated your question. So just for context, I used to work for the Maine Emergency Management Agency, and I updated the state hazard mitigation plan, so I'm familiar with these data sets. And now I work for USGS, and I actually lead my section updates FEMA risk map products. So we do flood mapping. So to your question, Dr. Va, what was done within the state hazard mitigation plan was to interpret the results, use the data, come up with an interpretation through analysis, and come up with problem statements. And those problem statements are the real motivation to come up with actions to reduce long-term risk. So they really should be, they eventually are converted into sort of the motivation for coming up with projects for mitigation grants. And other topics like that. So that's kind of what we did for that specific approach using the state hazard mitigation plan. And like Wes mentioned, it's really important to have high resolution data so that you can work on an operational basis on a structure by structure sort of resolution. It's really important because that's the resolution that our assets exist in. And I just wanted to have a couple comments. I know we're running out of time, but stream gauges was mentioned as a data set. Again, USGS were in charge of monitoring gauges and implementing gauges. I wanted to say that they're really critical. They're very they're not as common in Maine as they are in other states in New England, but they really form the basis for our flood mapping work. So they're the basis for developing our detailed study, for example, for mapping out zone AEs. There was a talk about how new flood maps and developing maps up to FEMA standards. FEMA has their own priorities list for what they want to complete. Currently, we're contracted with them to update survey data that would eventually go to new maps in the Mid-Coast area and in Androscoggin County and in Waldo County. So I'm not sure what the state of things are in those other areas where the flood maps are very old, decades old. And I'm not sure if the focus will change on them in the near future, but I did want to mention that process can take years and years. And one other thing, it's important that Sam Brody mentioned that it's really, that's not the only show in town. We don't necessarily have to focus on FEMA flood maps. The benefit of those is that they can be regulatory products, so they can actually be implemented through floodplain ordinances within a community. But those same standards can be used for other products. For example, we're working with cooperators within Massachusetts to develop pluvial models. Pluvial models they're more like flash flood style models. But I will say that there's not a lot of there's not a lot of great advancement in that type of modeling. It's really hit or miss. The accuracy levels are much lower. It's more difficult to use that for like a regulatory basis. It could be used for maybe a planning basis, but there's not as much support for that type of modeling, unfortunately. It does depend on much higher resolution, temporal and spatial data. But I also wanted to mention that it is possible to develop riverine or fluvial improved flood maps to FEMA standards without FEMA funding it, for example. Like we have the standards that could potentially be followed, but like I said, it's a long process. It involves a lot of different things. It depends on the level of accuracy you want. If you want enhanced studies, you need to do a lot of surveying, and you need to remodel reaches using the gauge data. Or you can do approximate studies, which are much faster and can really just depend on high resolution digital elevation models, which we have in Maine. So just wanted to give you that information dump.
That's great, Sam. Thanks for giving us the info on the ground there where you're doing the actual mapping work. Really appreciate it. Any other questions before we move on? We have a short meeting. As we said, we're going to be done here in 25 minutes at 3 o'clock today, but want to make sure that all your questions are answered about this tremendous data work that we're the lucky beneficiaries of, thanks to Sam and to Wes.
And I think this is just the start.
Yep.
There's some good examples of other initiatives out there. But just to kind of final comment, the younger, smarter people around me, which are many, have made me realize that we're on the cusp of a data revolution when it comes to problem solving. It's no longer just getting the data. With the advance of compute power, AI, machine learning techniques, our ability to integrate data, visualize data, and communicate it in ways that would probably boggle my mind as an old person. We're just on the verge of it. And so Maine capturing some of that, I think it's really good timing. Wes, you want to, any parting thoughts on that?
Well, they're younger than me too. But I don't know, the techniques available now to merge and predict and estimate are so far beyond what they were even 10 years ago that it is a real opportunity.
Yeah, and go ahead, Sam.
I'm happy to come back at a later date and either, maybe internally share some of these other state examples. The Texas example is one of them, but you're starting to see things converge and move forward, particularly with this whole AI revolution and kind of immersive visualization. which is a great way to communicate. And there's no reason Maine can't be implementing all those things.
Yeah, that's what's really exciting about this. I mean, unless I misheard him, what I thought I heard Wes say right at the beginning was that, that Maine's data on flood risk is pretty robust, right? So the data exists. So we're really talking about the analysis and the communication and the use of the data. And you can see, even if you're just an arts person like myself, how AI could be really, really useful and really instrumental in that work of analysis and communication. Exciting. Thank you. And I'm optimistic. I hope everybody on the screen heard that, we have robust data. We have robust data. We just have to be able to put it to use in the ways that make a meaningful difference for us. Great. Thanks again, Sam and Wes. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And there was a note in the chat from Bob saying he'd be happy to connect about all the data that the Insurance Bureau collects if we wanted to add that into your mix here. So
Excellent.
yeah, thanks for that, Bob. Okay, so we're going to spend the next 8 weeks meeting in 4 small groups. So we'll get even more intimate FaceTime with each other. We introduced these groups to you guys last month and asked you to indicate which of the groups you are interested in participating in. We've evolved those groups a little bit as things have evolved with LD1 and with other initiatives that have come along. So Brian's going to describe the work plan, what we're going to do next, and then we're going to ask you to confirm if you would like to or change your selection within the next day or so. So based on what you hear today of this slightly revised and modified work plan, if you want to jump ship and join another group, you get the option to do that. So it's these groups. And, we really came up with this plan knowing that we had to get down into the weeds a little bit more in order to finalize the plan, right? So in the first 6 months, we were working at the big concept level. We came up with our 12 recommendations. Those have been very impactful. Now we have to get down into the weeds of implementation a little bit more, and that's going to be more effective in these small groups. So this is going to enable the commission to do that, to get into the weeds on these critical topics, so that we can make really detailed final and actionable final recommendations. Okay, Brian, take it from there.
Great, thanks, Linda. That was a super setup. The groups that we introduced to you back in December, all of the topic areas are still there. We just kind of shuffled them a little bit between the groups, and so that's the update that we'll be giving you today is sort of where all those topics landed and give you an opportunity to change your group selection if you want to, or confirm that you want to stay where you selected in December. With these small groups, we're really going to lean into your individual areas of expertise and interest. And we're going to bring to you information from state agencies and other experts across the state. So we are going to try to bring you some new material to chew on in your groups as you start to develop and considerations for the commission when we report back in March. Each of the small groups will meet twice during February and into March. And so that's kind of the game plan. We're anticipating 90-minute to 2-hour meetings for these small groups. We're hoping that each of you will volunteer for at least one, but we want to give you the opportunity to participate in more than one if you want to. And so as we go through this, I will have indicated what your selections were back in December when we asked you to choose your first choice, and then we did ask for a second choice back then. And so after today's meeting, we'll have a survey for you to confirm that first choice and let us know if you do want to participate in a second or third group. So totally up to you. GoPIF staff is going to provide support to each of these small groups. We're going to help out with scheduling, with facilitation of the meetings, with research, note-taking, and then the summary writings for each of the groups. So really, we're hoping that you show up with your ideas, having reviewed some of the materials, and really bringing your thoughts and your input to the small groups and to shape the recommendations moving forward. At the outset, each group will receive some initial landscape information and several potential topics or questions to chew on over the 2 meetings. That will really set the table for the group's discussion. And at the first meeting, you'll use that meeting to review that initial information, narrow your scope probably down to 2 topics or 2 major questions to answer, and then think about what your deliverable for the small group should be, and use that to determine your agenda for the second meeting to get to your recommendations. At that second meeting, you'll discuss the topics that you've chosen, shape some recommendations, identify what lingering questions are behind, and can those questions be answered in the short term, or do we need to flag those for longer term discussion? And then provide your staff for the small group with enough detail to draft the group's summary of recommendations. And then we'll ask you by email to review and approve that summary so that it can be reported back to the commission at our March meeting. And as I mentioned, since last month, there have been some shuffling of topics among the groups. So I'm going to describe some of those changes now so that you know what the groups are charged with, what areas they'll be exploring, and then if you want to make any changes to your selections. So just a summary here of the changes that we've made to the groups. You'll remember that we had 4 groups. We still have 4, but we did merge the first 2. So the energy resilience group merged into the vulnerable infrastructure prioritization. Those conversations were really complementary, and so it made sense to bring these 2 groups together. And I'll talk about what the agenda or what the topics look like for that group in a moment. We split up what was group 3 earlier into 2 groups. You remember that this group really was going to focus on the capacity to implement projects. There was a workforce development and a business development component to this one. And then there was an understanding local challenges to implementation component. So we split that one up into 2 groups. The first one will really focus on the capacity question, and the second one will focus on permitting. And then the 4th group around funding and financing, there's no change to that one. That one didn't change at all. So I'll run through all 4 of these fairly quickly here and then talk about next steps. So the first group, this vulnerable infrastructure prioritization group, which includes transportation and now electricity, water, and working waterfront infrastructure, has several key questions around what are some potential criteria the state might utilize to prioritize infrastructure projects and funding for implementation? Can we make some estimates about the cost, the cumulative cost for each of these types of infrastructure, just to get a sense of what the dollar spend over, say, the next 10 years might be? And can we identify communities with the highest impact from power outages and make some recommendations around solutions, including community microgrids? I've indicated here where you all have selected your first or second choice to participate in this group. There's a lot of interest in this one, and certainly when we merged it with the energy resilience conversation, there's a nice list of people here participating. So again, let us know if this is still your first choice. For those of you who indicated this is a second choice, let us know if you absolutely want to participate in this one. You're more than welcome to. The meeting dates are here, February 13th and February 26th. We really tried to schedule these out so that each of the groups has meetings that don't overlap with one another. So if people do want to participate in more than one group, they can. So hopefully these dates work for you, and certainly be in touch with us if you think you can make one or more of the meetings. All right, the second group is thinking now about capacity, workforce, and business development to design and complete resiliency projects. So ensuring that our municipal and regional capacity is there to identify and develop projects, that the firms in Maine have skilled workers for all aspects of project development and construction, and that we have firms with the specializations needed in Maine, particularly for coastal infrastructure projects, green infrastructure, wastewater, and stormwater projects in the scale that we need to get it done. The membership here was really drawn from that group 3 earlier. So you'll notice the same set of members here and on the next slide. This is the one where in particular, we're asking for people to confirm their participation in one group or the other or both. Here's the membership and meeting dates. And then I will jump to the third group, which is the permitting conversation. understanding the state's current activities around reforms to permitting. There's actually quite a bit going on, and so the group will have some information on that. And then suggesting what additional actions are not on that list that the state should consider around permitting and bettering that balance between resilience and environmental protections. The last group, the funding and financing for resiliency projects, this one is unchanged from December. We're going to bring information about how the bipartisan infrastructure law's federal investments for infrastructure improvements have landed in Maine. And then this group, somewhat similar to the first group, will suggest sort of what an ongoing annual investment is needed in Maine as those federal BIL funds wind down over the next couple of years. And then suggesting long-term funding and financing mechanisms and suggesting long-term roles for philanthropy. Both of these final two bullets here pick up conversations that we had in the interim recommendations and try to further those recommendations. Again, the folks who selected into this group and indicated that this might be a second choice as well, please do confirm whether or not you want to be in this group and if you want to join us as a second group. Meeting dates are here, and so you'll see most of these meetings happen in the middle part of February to early March. We think that that gives time for some digestion of the preliminary information, for that initial conversation around sort of scoping out the small groups questions and topics, and then coming back for a second meeting to really dig in and think about what those recommendations or considerations are going to be. And then some time for staff to write those up, get them back to you for review, and then bring it to the March meeting. One more slide here on the next steps, and then I can stop and take some questions. There it is. Hannah just put in the chat a link to a form for you to fill out based on your choices. Please do indicate if you which group you want to participate in as your primary group, and then your choice if you want to join a second or a third group. Please indicate those in the form. We're going to ask you to fill this out. If you have 5 minutes to do it right now or at the end of this meeting, please do that. But certainly help us out by Friday so that we can start getting calendar holds out to you for that. We will get those calendar holds out. You'll probably start seeing them this afternoon if you complete the surveys, and then we'll continue to roll them out over the next couple of days. And then in the period before your small group, your first meeting, we'll send agendas and some of that preliminary information that will help inform your discussions. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions before handing it back over to Dan and Linda to take us home.
Looks like
Judy.
Judy's got her hand up.
Thanks. Just a quick one. I noticed that I think it was Feb 13. I might have that wrong, but one of them coincided with the February meeting of this whole group. So
Yes.
that will substitute for that meeting, will it? That'll get taken
Correct.
off the calendar? Okay.
Yeah, we are not going to have the February 13th meeting. We scheduled, I believe, 2 of the groups to meet during that time, since we knew that most of you would have it available. So there are a couple of meetings happening during that window, but we will not have a full commission meeting
Okay.
in February.
Yeah, Brian, a couple things. First of all, great work in synthesizing everything. I would encourage, once the participation on the committees gets formed, if there are people on those committees that have, specific questions where perhaps the staff could gather information and supply the committees with just some background data on things, I think that would be helpful. I mean, it probably puts a bit more work on you, Brian, and your team, but for instance, I'm interested in the permitting, and I would expand the permitting to not just permitting, but permitting and building codes and, that sort of thing. There may be specific questions where we could get some data beforehand so we don't start from zero.
That's great, Dan. Thank you. And in that survey link that you all have, I believe there's a window there where you can add additional notes and questions and comments, and that would be a great place to start indicating that so we can get a jump on that research.
Kurt, you have a question?
Just real quick and not important. It looked to me, I was just focused on the names as we were going through the groups. It looked like 2 and 3 were very similar. So if that was spoken to, I missed it. But I noticed, I think my name was on both of those, and I don't remember putting a third one. And it looked like the list of names was almost exactly the same in those 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Great observation, Kurt. That's right, because we actually split that third group up into those 2 that you see. So the membership is actually just copy and pasted over. So that's why we're asking folks to actually reconfirm which one or both of them they'd like to be in. So you're spot on.
I figured it was spoken to. Apologies. Thanks.
Any other questions about our process moving into February before we I hand it over to Dan to close us out?
Great. I'll just add that these small group meetings will be posted. They'll be publicly available for folks to observe. So if you're observing us today in the public, just look in the calendar in the same place you get the information for this meeting, where you register for this meeting. You'll see that those will be posted with the dates and links to join and observe.
So,
Great.
Linda, should I take
It's
close
all
her up?
yours.
All
All
right.
yours.
Well, I think this was a great meeting. The data that Wes and Sam you provided was mind-blowing and wonderful. And but I do agree with Dr. Va that ultimately we need to figure out a way as a committee to clarify that down to something that is understandable at the community level. And I see that, you know, our new community, Maine community organization is, you know, probably where that gets pushed out to, you know, to all the municipalities, large and small, around the state. So you know, we should think about what form we want to get that into sooner than later, at least the first phase, because it takes a long time to get that put together. And if we want some of that to be going out the door in May seems like a long ways off, but it's not. I want to encourage everybody in the subcommittees. You know, one of the reasons the governor formed this committee the way it was because of the technical expertise that everybody here has. And, you know, we really do see these small subcommittee meetings, these topic areas, as the place for folks that have deep technical expertise and industry leading positions to really weigh in on, you know, what should happen. That's where, you know, we've been much more general. Now we're going to get really specific. And so, you know, I think that's I encourage people to come fired up and without, you know, any handcuffs on, and you know, speak from personal experience and try to really, you know, we're not going to ignore any problems if problems come up because they're not popular to talk about. So I just think whatever's on people's minds. And, you know, for some of us who have been deep into some of the topics, you know, one of the things that I hope we will be able to do is leave the first meetings and perhaps bring some of the expertise within our skill sets into the dialogue between the first and second meetings to help Brian and his team synthesize very specific stuff. I mean, we have people that represent building and infrastructure and roads and electric and, you know, and workforce and a lot others, but you know, to be able to really push those topics along. With that, I just want to say thanks for participating. I think probably Linda and I are going to float a little bit. I will participate in two committees. So I'll be seeing some of you in the next month or so, and Linda and I are going to try to not overlap on the same committees. And then we'll see you all later as a whole later in the spring.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in the small groups in February and then on March 19th, coming back together as a full commission. Look forward to your work. Thanks for everything.
Thank you.
Everybody, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.